everyone. Welcome to the All About Animals radio show. We are a volunteer-run community radio station dedicated to all animals and those who advocate for them. My name is Nikita Dhawan, and today we have Peter Singer as a guest. Professor Singer is a highly acclaimed and influential philosopher and author who has been credited with starting the modern animal rights movement with his work in animal and practical ethics. He has received the Berger Prize for Philosophy and Culture and has established many and published many books, including the 1975 edition of Animal Liberation. He has founded organizations Animals Australia and The Life You Can Save, dedicated to helping animals and those in extreme poverty, respectively. And today we're going to be discussing his newest book edition called Animal Liberation Now. I'm really excited to have you here, Professor Singer. How are you today?
I'm fine, Nikita. Good to talk to you.
Great. Thank you so much for joining. I've read your book and I think it was great. It really changed my perspective on how I see animals. And I'm curious to understand what was your initial involvement in the field of animal ethics and your inspiration to write the first book itself.
Well, my initial background was really my interest in ethics and ethical questions. I was never and still don't really consider myself an animal lover. I'm not a person who, wants to have companion animals around me particularly. But I became aware of the way we treat animals, particularly in order to turn them into the meat that I was then eating. This was in 1970 when I was 24 years old. And that just struck me as wrong. And although, as I say, I wasn't an animal lover, I was always against cruelty to animals. Every decent person ought to be against cruelty to animals. But I didn't realize that I was participating in this vast and systematic cruelty to animals, essentially to produce them as cheaply as possible for food, irrespective of how much that harms them. And when I say harms them, I don't just mean killing them. Of course, I knew that, but giving them miserable lives by confining them indoors in enormous factory farms, very crowded, conditions completely unsuitable for the nature of the species, and really no concern for the well-being of the individual animal at all, just the sort of market pressure to produce the meat or eggs or dairy products as cheaply as possible.
Right. And, you mentioned your initial background was in ethics. So can you just give us an overview of what is the animal liberation philosophy and what justifies giving equal consideration to the pain animals feel compared to humans?
Right. So there isn't one animal liberation philosophy, really. I certainly put forward the views I hold in Animal Liberation, and now more recently, of course, in Animal Liberation Now. But my views fit with my general ethical background, which is utilitarian. That means I think that whether an act is right or wrong depends on its consequences for the well-being of all of those who are affected by the action. And by all of those, I don't mean only humans. I mean any beings who are conscious, who are capable of enjoying their lives, or conversely, capable of suffering, feeling pain, and having a miserable life. And so that definitely includes non-human animals. But there are other people like the late Tom Regan, who argued on the basis of animal rights. There's a Kantian philosopher, Christine Korsgaard, who has adapted Kantian ethics to reach a similar conclusion. I think the most important link, the most important common factor between all the philosophers who write in a positive way about animals, and there are many of them now, is that they don't think that ethics is just limited to human beings. They don't see any justification for saying that the boundary line of our species is the boundary line of those beings who matter morally, who have a moral status, where it makes a difference what we do to them. And so once you can see past that species boundary and include animals, and you want to take an ethical approach to them, then almost any defensible ethical position is going to say, yes, you have to include animals and you ought not to be treating them in the ways we do. For example, as I say, in factory farms.
Right. And you talk about, giving equal consideration to animal interests and how it's not about how equality has never really been based on like factual equality, like actual equality in our abilities, because many people argue that, humans are smarter than animals. So that's why we have rights that they don't. So how would you comment on like the difference, how when people use intelligence as an argument for speciesism, which you describe as a form of discrimination against different species?
Yes, well, I think Jeremy Bentham, who was the founder of utilitarian philosophy in the late 18th and early 19th century, put the answer to the question you've just asked very well. He was actually writing after the French Revolution, and he noticed in one of his writings, or mentioned, that the French had discovered that the color of a person's skin is not a reason for enslaving them, because the French revolutionaries freed the slaves in the French colonies. And he just goes on, and after noticing that, his little footnote saying that perhaps one day people will discover that the number of legs, or whether you have a tail, or whether you have fur, are also not good reasons for abandoning a sensitive being, he says, to the caprice of a tormentor. And then he obviously, thinks about the issue that you just mentioned and says, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And then he sort of imagines, I think, an objection to that, and says, suppose that wasn't the case. Suppose you think that whether you can reason or talk is the morally crucial dividing line. A dog or a horse is actually more capable of reasoning and more capable of conversing than a baby of a day or a week or a month old. And so, right, as he points out, if we really wanted to say that the capacity to reason or talk is what draws the line of beings who can't, then infants would not count. Some people might say, well, they have a potential to talk, which is true, but people with profound intellectual disabilities might never have a potential to talk or to reason. But we still don't think that we should treat them the way we treat animals today.
Yeah, so yeah, that makes complete sense. So I think, like, I understood from your book that like the characteristic of intelligence is not what always upholds humans above non-human animals. So why should it be used as a basis that their interests matter more? And I think it's interesting, as you just mentioned, like drawing parallels to racism and sexism, because as it has implications about how we think about animals. Because some of the justifications behind speciesism include, we are the superior race, or this is how the system has always been, so why should we change? But we use those arguments to also justify racism, or cases of slavery in the past. So I think it makes us think about how it extends to animals as well. And
that's quite right. And that's kind of, in a way, the point of using the term speciesism, to make that parallel with things that most people will reject, like racism and sexism. And just as, the parallel here is, in all of these cases, there was a dominant, powerful group which attributed to itself rights over the other ones who were less powerful, and who the dominant group regarded as inferior or lower moral status in some way. And of course, we can see through those justifications for racism and sexism today, but we ourselves are really doing the same thing towards animals when we draw the boundary at the boundary of our species for whether we take seriously the interests of a being, or, as you said, give equal consideration to the interests of a being.
Yeah, and it also, I think all those cases highlight an in-group and out-group mentality where we sort of exclude other groups as the other. So like we've learned about that in psychology and everything. So I also wanted to, just based on what we've discussed, what prompted you to write a second updated edition of the book? Would you say that the target audience or the purpose of the book has evolved since then?
Well, the target audience is certainly a different generation,
Yeah.
and they've changed in a variety of ways, of course. But for me, what was most important was to keep the book relevant to what we're doing to animals today. And a book that was first written in 1975, and then the last full revision was 1990, that's not able to describe the way animals are treated today. So I was concerned that a new generation of readers would say, well, what's this got to do with where I am now?
Mhm.
And they might think of the book as having historical interest. They might read it for the ethical arguments, which we've just been discussing, which I don't think have changed. But in terms of the two long chapters that I have that describe one of them, the experiments done on animals, which are often very painful and quite pointless for us anyway, and factory farming. Those two chapters needed complete updating because things have changed in that respect, and I wanted to show that the problems haven't gone away despite those changes. And I also wanted to talk a bit about the progress that the movement has made, because
Right.
there has been some progress in some countries, not everywhere, and that's encouraging, and that's good and something we must work with. But also, in some respects, things have got worse, partly because in countries like China, where people have become more prosperous, they are buying more meat. And so China is producing a lot more meat and has vast factory farms that it didn't have in 1975. So I needed to basically update that and inform the readers what the situation is and what we still need to do.
Yeah, and you said that the ethical argument has mainly stayed the same. So I was wondering, like, what about the counter arguments? What would you say is one of the strongest or most common arguments that oppose I guess, the animal liberation philosophy, and how would you address them?
Well, I don't think there are any good arguments in defense of factory farming, for example. You know, not even some people believe that somehow we need this in order to feed the growing world population. But it's actually a wasteful system in terms of food production. We are taking a lot of crops that we grow, which are good nutrients and contain both calories and protein, and we
Mhm.
feed them to animals, and we actually reduce, in some cases, quite dramatically reduce the amount of food value that we get from it, because when we then kill the animal, let's say you're talking about a cow that's we fed on grains, and now we're killing for beef,
Mhm.
we get back only something like 3% of the protein that we put into the cow. So it's that's a really bad objection, the idea that we need factory farming to feed the world's population. Um, the arguments that I struggle with are ones that are accept the case against factory farming, but reject the case against being vegetarian or vegan by saying that we can obtain animal products from animals who are well treated. And whether you consider that an argument for or against animal liberation will depend on your own position and how far you think we ought to go. And I know there are some people in the animal movement who think that it's just wrong to kill animals at all, even if they've had wonderful lives and been killed painlessly. Now, I'm less sure about that. I think there's some interesting philosophical questions about whether it's better to live and have a good life and then die prematurely than it is to not live at all. And so that's why I don't claim that I can show that it is wrong to rear animals and give them good lives and kill them painlessly and then eat them. But in practice, that's a very, very small proportion of all the animals we raise, unfortunately. So I
Mhm.
would say, really the animal liberation movement could be targeting those systems like factory farming, which cause such immense suffering to a vast number of animals. And if there are some people who still occasionally eat some meat that they can get from animals who have good lives, I think we should welcome the fact that they don't support factory farming and not waste our energy in attacking them or trying to criticize them, because we should focus on the much worse things that are happening at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. I think you had raised some moral questions about creating life, because many people say if there wasn't demand for meat in the first place, then the livestock wouldn't have, like the life wouldn't have been created in the first place. So that's a difficult argument. And just regarding factory farming, would you be able to elaborate a bit more on just the reality of modern day factory farming and in what ways it prioritizes economic interests over animal welfare?
Yeah, sure. So let's take chickens because of the land-based vertebrates, so not counting fish. Chickens are the most numerous of the animals who are factory farmed. We're talking about something like maybe 60 or 70 billion chickens raised worldwide each year, and it's something like 8 to 9 billion in the United States alone. So these numbers are enormous. Now, what is particularly bad about this? So pretty much all of these chickens, 99.9% probably, are raised indoors in big sheds where they're very crowded, and obviously they're not raised in the way that would be natural to them. That is to have a mother hen around them when they're small, looking after them. They come from a hatchery and they're just dumped on conveyor belts into these big sheds and fend for themselves. But on top of that, there's another problem from the fact that they have been deliberately bred to grow as fast as possible. So the modern chicken is sold at between 6 and 7 weeks of age. So a very young bird, but a very large bird for that very young age. They're getting to that weight that they're sold at least twice as quickly as they would have maybe 50 years ago. So that causes problems with their bone formation because their leg bones are not really mature enough to hold the weight of their bodies. And so you do get in every flock that's raised, although they're very young birds, you get mortality that's in the industry typically around 5%. And that is these birds, their legs may collapse under them and then they can't get to food or water. So they just die of thirst or starvation because they can't walk anymore once their leg bones have collapsed. And there's no individual attention for these birds. There's 10, 20,000 birds in a single shed. So no one is looking after them individually. Now, another less obvious fact about this is that these birds grow so fast because they've been bred to have an enormous appetite. So they've been bred to basically keep eating a lot, and that's why they put on so much weight so fast.
Right.
But think about their parents, right? So their parents obviously have to have the same genes to want to eat all the time, to be very hungry. But if they were allowed to eat as much as they like, they would probably collapse before they got to sexual maturity, because you don't get to sexual maturity at 6 or 7 weeks like the birds that people eat. They would need to live much longer than that, maybe 3 times as long. And if they were continuing to eat as much as they wanted, they would get very fat. They might die of heart attacks or something of that sort. And even if they didn't, they probably would not be able to mate just because they would be so large and fat. In fact, this happens with turkeys as well. The American turkey can't mate, and all the turkeys that Americans eat at Thanksgiving are the result of artificial insemination. which obviously adds expense, and the chicken producers don't want to do that. So essentially, they starve the parents. They typically feed them only every second day, so that they don't get too fat, and so that they can still mate when they're mature. And this is for birds bred to have a huge appetite. This is a real kind of torture to prevent them getting food. And you can see in the farming journals themselves, they say, for example, that these birds will take in a lot of water on the day when they don't get any food. They're just trying to fill themselves. But that can cause health problems to them. So I quote articles saying, well, you have to cut off the water, otherwise they'll drink too much. So that's just, an example of the attitude of factory farmers. Their productivity at all costs. Don't worry about the welfare of the animals as long as they survive long enough to get to market, or as long as the breeding birds survive long enough to reproduce and produce future generations. That's really all they care about.
Yeah, and there also seems to be, I remember reading a quote in the book that says there's no time to give them any painkiller because that's just not a priority. And like when they're debeaked, they're not given a painkiller, or even if when they're getting going to the slaughterhouse, they're not properly stunned and can die when they're conscious. And yeah, someone in a similar field in factory farming talked about how sometimes they would alter the chicken's genes, or manipulate their growth hormones in order to increase production. So I guess that's just an example of prioritizing economic interests over their welfare. And in your book, you also talk about, boycotting the meat industry. And I was just wondering, how would you respond to a consumer who believes that a single action of stopping to purchase meat would have no impact on the larger industry of factory farming? Because that's a common argument.
It's a common argument, but obviously the number of chickens produced is dependent on the number of people buying chickens. Now, that doesn't mean that there's a one-to-one ratio. It doesn't mean that if somebody who's been buying chickens stops buying a chicken this week, that there'll be one fewer chicken raised in a factory farm. But what we're trying to do is to build a movement of people who are going to be non-consumers of factory farm products, perhaps completely vegan, perhaps vegetarian, perhaps just reducitarian, as it's sometimes called, reducing the amount of meat that they eat, and perhaps just avoiding factory farm products. So that has to make a difference. And I think the situation is, yes, you can't know that your individual purchase prevents chickens from having or a chicken or a number of chickens from having miserable lives. But what you can know is that it increases the odds that there will be fewer chickens who are raised. Because I look at it this way: suppose that the supermarket orders chickens by the hundred, so it's not sensitive to one more or one fewer chicken being bought. But if the level of purchases falls below a certain number, then they'll order 100 fewer chickens next week. Well, maybe the chicken you buy doesn't actually trigger the reduction in the number of chickens ordered. But if it does, and 1 in 100 chickens will, then it'll actually reduce the order by 100 chickens, and that'll feed back to the producers. And with other orders, they will then reduce their production. So, there has to be that kind of relationship between individual purchases and production. So I think that's still what we ought to do. We are still complicit in supporting the industry if we buy its products.
Yeah, definitely. Someone's one purchase can definitely have the potential. If they keep purchasing less meat, then it makes sense that they would reach a threshold eventually where the supermarket would order less chicken. So like one argument for adopting a vegan diet is obviously to reduce animal suffering and to provide more food for the growing world population, as you mentioned, because a lot of land is used to feed the livestock. Can you elaborate more on the benefits regarding climate change and just the meat industry's connection to that as well?
Yes, climate change is another important reason for avoiding meat. And I think a lot of people who are vegan or vegetarian nowadays are at least partly that, because they want to reduce the impact that they're having on climate change. And meat is a major contributor, meat and dairy, I should say, particularly, are major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. Something like 1/5 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from the animal production industry. So yeah, a lot of this is methane produced particularly by ruminant animals like cows, whether beef or dairy, and sheep. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, particularly in the short term. It's something like maybe 80 times as potent as carbon dioxide. So even though the amounts of methane produced by the animal industry are not as great as all the carbon dioxide produced by burning fossil fuels, it still has a very big effect on climate change. And the other important point about it is it's something we can do something about right now. Mm-hmm. We don't have to wait for new technologies. We don't have to say, oh, we can't get rid of fossil fuels because we don't have electric batteries that are powerful enough to run cars the distance that people want to run them, or the electric cars are too expensive. We have to make them cheaper and more accessible. All those things are true in the area of reducing fossil fuel consumption, and they're important. But it's really easier to shift from a meat-based diet to a vegan diet. That's something that everybody, at least everybody living in a comfortable, affluent society who can walk into a supermarket and sees a range of plant-based products that are as nutritious or more nutritious than the animal products and better for you. Everybody in that situation can do that, and they can do it right now. So I think it's a really effective way to reduce your greenhouse gas footprint and to make a difference for climate, as well as we were saying, for feeding the world and for reducing the suffering of animals.
Yeah, exactly. And as you're talking about just the role of individual action by the consumers themselves, we're also, we have responsibility in purchasing products that have been tested on animals, like cosmetics and cleaning products. So can you just talk a bit about what are some of the practices of animal testing that causes large amounts of suffering, and are these actually effective or beneficial for humankind?
Well, there's a lot, in the chapter in Animal Liberation now on research in animals, I talk about a lot of different kinds of research. Product testing is certainly one of them. It's one of the areas where we have made some progress from the earlier editions of the book, because some of the tests that I described there, for example, the LD50, which stood for lethal dose for 50% of your sample of animals. And that was the standard required test in many countries, including the United States, for new products coming onto the market that people might eat or that might take, and obviously that caused an immense amount of suffering to actually feed animals enough so that half of them die from what you're feeding them. But that test has not been completely abolished, but it has been greatly reduced. But it's still the case that very large numbers, millions of animals are used in testing, maybe as many as 100 million in the United States each year, or something close to that, in testing and in other research. And so they're still being made to get ill from substances that are being fed to them. Also, their housing pays no attention to their needs. In fact, there was a study done not long ago that shows that rats and mice, which are the largest numbers of animals used in research, are actually stressed by living in these tiny shoebox-like plastic containers. And rats and mice love to go and hide in some little place. That's their more natural environment is to be in shelter, not out in the open. But in these containers, they're stressed because there's really no cover that they can go under. So the study showed that actually distorts the findings of research using them, that if you used animals who had better housing conditions, you would get different kinds of results. And that gets to the point that a lot of these results simply don't translate across to humans. In Animal Liberation Now, I quote a former director of the United States National Institutes of Health, so the biggest research funding body in the country, who said, we've got very good at curing cancer in mice, but it doesn't translate across to humans. And we really need to get serious about doing clinical studies on humans who have these conditions and trying to test products in ways that are closer to humans. And sometimes we can do this without using animals at all, like using skin cultures, in vitro cultures, and testing products on them. Increasingly, we can use AI, at least to screen a lot of products and to say, we don't need to test this. It's obvious that it's going to cause harm to humans or to the animals that we would test it on. Right. There's a lot of different things that we can do to try to reduce the number of animals, and I hope eventually eliminate.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's definitely a misconception with the public thinking that animals have led to significant medical breakthroughs for humans. So all animal experimentation is therefore justified. But I think that would just be a bias, because like we've only seen a small percent of animal experiments that have been conclusive and have provided helpful results due to like factors like publication bias, which you mentioned in your book. But that's only a small percent compared to the much larger percent of animal testing, which is ineffective or repetitive, like the Me Too drugs, which you had said, or provide the same effects, but they're just by different companies. Or a lot of them are just towards trivial products like cleaning products. So I guess one of the reasons the public may be ignorant towards the flaws in animal testing is that the scale of these experiments are largely underestimated. But regarding the medical discoveries itself, when, if ever, is it justified to use animals for experiments?
Well, I think it could be justified if there is some really important, well, let me start again. I think it could be justified if there is a reasonable expectation that you could find either a cure or an effective treatment for a condition that affects a very large number of people, or including a large number of animals. And you can do that in ways that use only a limited number of animals, that tries to reduce the suffering inflicted on them as far as is possible. And there are no alternatives to using animals. So I think you have to explore all the alternatives first before considering whether you would experiment on animals. And then there may be some cases where the expectation of an important breakthrough in a major condition is great enough to justify strictly limited use of animals. But taking the practice as a whole, I think it clearly does a lot more harm than it does good. And it does harm, as I say, not only to animals, but to humans because of the waste of resources that we're using and the misleading results that we get for humans. So I think it's really an industry that needs to be dramatically changed. And I think that is increasingly recognized even by people in the field. And if you look at the experiments that I describe in the chapter in Animal Liberation Now, you will see that a lot of them just cannot be justified, that they're trying to do things that are clearly not translating to humans, like research on mental health conditions that humans suffer from, which obviously you can't really model properly in non-human animals, because we as humans live in a quite different environment, an environment that is social, and we talk to people about our problems, and it's a different kind of situation.
Yeah, I think you had mentioned like the Dre's test doesn't have like a standard or quantitative measurement of its effectiveness. So a lot of animal experiments can also be difficult to replicate. So that makes it less useful for the scientific.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of experiments that don't replicate in different ways, and the Dray's test is one of them. That's another one that we've made some progress on. That's an eye test in which substances are put directly into the eyes of rabbits without any anesthetic being used on the animal's eye, and it produced some of these substances produced horrible damage and blistering to the eyes of the rabbits. I think the pressure from the animal movement has dramatically reduced the way in which the number of animals that is done on, and somewhat modified the way in which it's done, so it's not as bad as before. So we can take some credit for that, but again, it's not been completely eliminated.
Yeah, and in both factory farming and animal experimentation, there's I guess there can be some responsibility towards the consumers. Like we're able to boycott products or adopt veganism, and we can make change at an individual level, and that's really important. But I was just wondering, what if we zoom out? Because there's a discussion as to whether it can be effective to use a more, I guess, top-down approach to address animal interests and equally give them equal consideration, for example, from a legal perspective. So, for example, several organizations have attempted to petition courts to recognize certain animals, such as Happy, an elephant in the Bronx Zoo, as a quote unquote person, so that she can obtain legal rights associated with people, such as that of bodily autonomy. So, what is your opinion on this approach as to legally extend personhood for some animals?
Well, I welcome all approaches that have a chance of advancing the moral status of animals, giving them better protection, including better legal protection. So I think that the efforts of people who've been doing this, like Stephen Wise of the Non-Human Rights Project, which brought the case for Happy the elephant that you mentioned, and other cases on behalf of chimpanzees and great apes. I think that's definitely worth attempting. And in fact, it was quite interesting that when the case of Happy the elephant went on appeal all the way up to the highest court in the state of New York, and that court, although it did decide against Happy and against the Non-Human Rights Project, there were two dissenting judges. So there were two judges who said that it should have been granted. And I think that's interesting, and it shows that the idea that non-human animals are persons is making progress in legal circles. And in South America, in fact, there have been a couple of cases where the courts have upheld that for great apes. I think maybe one was an orangutan and one was a chimpanzee. So, I welcome these initiatives. I think that we need to try different ways of changing the situation with regard to animals, and let's try different things and see what works.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great start with the two judges, seeing merit in the case. And a reason that, Happy was used was because, as people know, elephants have a very advanced cognitive and social ability which is similar to humans. So it's implied that maybe there's a stronger reason for her to gain personhood. So I was just wondering, when expanding our moral circle to animals, are there certain animals that we should prioritize first? Does the degree of mental capabilities play a role in which animals are considered first, or is that a form of speciesism itself? Should we just focus on if they feel pain and suffering?
It's not exactly speciesism to focus on mental capacities, but I still think it's true that what really matters is the capacity to suffer. I think, the reason for using great apes or elephants is that we have a better chance of convincing both courts and the general public that they have the moral and legal status of a person than we would if we were to choose let's say those laboratory rats or mice that we were talking about before. We can see better with them the nature of their lives. We can empathize more with them. We can understand their complex social relationships. we can see that they have intentions, we can see that they have good memories, and I think that helps to break down the gulf between humans and animals, which is such a problem. So I think it's worth doing if it helps people to see that we're on a continuum with other animals. There's not just somehow humans over on one side and all other animals together, as if the animals are all alike. There are some animals who are close to us in their mental capacities and in their genes, for that matter, the great apes, and others who are more distant from us in one or both of those respects. So yeah, I think it's not speciesist, and if it's a useful tactic, I think we should do it. But I'm certainly think that any being capable of suffering is worthy of our consideration.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you said, there are different approaches to making change in the animal rights movement, which we should explore. So just when we're talking about the most effective change, I just wanted to touch on how you've also been heavily involved in the effective altruism movement, or how to do good better. So to end off, can you just talk about the linkage between effective altruism and animal ethics, and how we as listeners can also apply some of those principles to help reduce animal suffering?
Right. Well, the effective altruism movement is a relatively recent movement, maybe 15 years old now, of people who want to do some good for the world, want to reduce suffering, help other humans or help animals, and they want to do it as effectively as possible, or they think it's important to do it as effectively as possible. That is, to use whatever time or money you've got to make the world a better place, and get the most out of that. And that's very relevant to the animal movement, because if you look at a graph of where does the most money go that people donate to help animals, the answer to that is overwhelmingly it goes to organizations that are assisting stray dogs and cats, basically, shelter organizations. And look, it's good to want to help dogs and cats, of course, but when you look at the amount of suffering that is inflicted on the factory farmed animals we were talking about, I talked about the numbers of chickens, for example, in the United States alone, something like close to 9 billion chickens. That dwarfs the amount of suffering that stray dogs and cats are going through. In fact, it dwarfs the total number of dogs and cats in the United States. And of course, only a small percentage of those, fortunately, are stray or need the assistance of these charitable organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So it's from the effective altruist point of view, it's misguided to donate to those organizations. You will get better bang for your buck if you donate to organizations that are opposing factory farming, and that are doing that as effectively as possible. And to do that, you can go to a website called Animal Charity Evaluators, and they look at the organizations. They've evaluated a lot of organizations for basically how much good they are doing and how much good they're doing per dollar of donation that they receive. And you will see that essentially, most of those organizations they recommend are focusing on factory farmed animals, because we can make progress in that area. We have been making progress, and when you donate to them, you're likely to help far more animals and do much more to relieve animal suffering than if you donate to the shelter organizations.
Yeah, definitely. And then I remember I had done an effective altruism course, and we had talked about your book, and the course was also talking about how like impartiality is important in terms of who we can help, like not maybe prioritizing people just because they're in your country or a certain group. So I guess that would apply to how we extend our moral consideration to animals as well. And yeah, I think we can definitely learn from what you said about helping factory farm animals and focusing on the industries which largely inflict animal suffering. So I wanted just to thank you so much for all the work you're doing. It's really inspiring, and it's definitely, changed my mentality. Yeah, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you, Nikita. It's been good talking to you, and thanks for making people alert to all of these important issues about animals. I really appreciate what you're doing with the program.